So we started the nervous system discussion talking about the different cells that we find in the nervous system. And we focused a lot of time on the neuron because I wanted you guys to see how information moves through the nervous system. We also learned about that process of the action potential where electricity moves down the neuron from usually the dendrite cell body side to the synaptic terminal side. Then we talked about those spaces in between neurons, the synapses, and the fact that the electrical signal doesn't travel from one neuron to the next, but the electrical signal travels down and then a chemical gets released to continue that message from one neuron to the next. That's how the nervous system carries information around, through that electrical impulse called the action potential. Then we started to talk about the different parts of the nervous system. We're going to focus first on the central nervous system, which happens to be the brain and the spinal cord. Remember, there's also a peripheral nervous system, which has to do with the periphery, or all these nerves that run off of the spinal cord and off of the brain out into the face. The brain and the spinal cord you can think of as responsible for most of the processing of us as people. Our reality, our perception is all processed in the brain and spinal cord. Most of the processing happens in the brain, but information comes in through the spinal cord. And there's a little bit of processing that takes place in the spinal cord, but we mostly think of the brain as the processing computer for our nervous system. And the brain has different parts, 6 parts we've talked about. We haven't gone through each of the 6 parts yet, but 6 main parts. And in those 6 parts, there are lots of smaller parts. And in some of the parts, we talked about some of the smaller parts. For instance, when we talked about the brain stem here, we've spoken a little bit about the medulla oblongata. Right here, the medulla oblongata is the bottommost part of our brainstem and bottommost part of the brain, minus the cerebellum, which is back here, kind of off on its own. The medulla oblongata. What's one thing the medulla oblongata is responsible for controlling? It's a very primitive part of our nervous system, very primitive part. Kimberly says heart rate, excellent. What else? Will says heart rate, excellent. So it controls the rate that our heart beats. Gloria says breathing, wonderful. Also controls our breathing, the rate of our breathing and the breathing itself. Kimberly says blood flow, excellent. It also controls the blood flow into our fingers, our hands, our arms, our abdomen. So you could think of the medulla oblongata as responsible for our life functions, keeping us alive, making sure the heart rate increases when it needs to, decreases when we relax, increasing when we're doing activity or stressed out, decreasing when we're relaxed, not doing activity. Also does the same thing with our breathing and our blood flow. Remember, if you're active, if you're running around, if you're stressed out, you're going to have more blood flow to your periphery because you're going to need to manipulate those muscles. You may have to run, you may have to grab something, you may have to fight. And so the medulla oblongata is really the control center for that. But it's part of a bigger structure known as the brainstem. Right above the medulla oblongata is the pons. The pons is responsible for carrying incoming sensory information. So information like what we call proprioception, which is where body parts are located. It's actually thought of as the 6th sense, the location of our body parts. And all that information is going in, and it's going through the brainstem, through the medulla oblongata, through the pons, and then into the cerebellum. The cerebellum then is responsible for what? What does the cerebellum do for us? What is it really important for? Remember, it's taking in all this information from the spine, going through the pons, and then through this little strip of neurons. That's actually the only connection the cerebellum has to the rest of the brainstem. What is the cerebellum responsible for? Processing information, good, Kim. What type of information? Remember we saw that video of the guy who had damage to one side of his cerebellum? Cerebellar ataxia. Remember he couldn't control the muscle movements to be able to put his finger to the tip of his nose smoothly like he could do on the other side. Will, coordination, good. So it coordinates all of that incoming information, and then it sends important signals up into the cerebrum here, where muscles are then controlled and told to move. So incoming information from the spinal cord goes through the pons into the cerebellum. It goes out here into all of these little branches. That information is processed into a pattern that then gets sent back through the pons up into the cerebrum, where we have we actually have a strip of tissue right here that's responsible for controlling all of our muscle movements. And so writing is heavily coordinated by the cerebellum. Dancing, it's heavily coordinated by the cerebellum. Any type of athletic sport, like running, kicking a ball, even getting up from a seated position and sitting down. If I didn't have a functioning cerebellum, my muscles would overfire and underfire, and I wouldn't be able to coordinate that movement into smooth movement. And obviously, Mr. Gorgoni is quite smooth in his movements. Right? I have a well-developed cerebellum. That was a joke, guys. So the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating those smooth muscle movements. Above the pons. Remember, the pons is the connecting point for the cerebellum. Right above this, we have what part? What is this part called? The midbrain. So the midbrain is responsible for what? What is our midbrain responsible for? So, Gloria, good. She says hearing. It's definitely a part of hearing. But it's more of a response to hearing. What else? Midbrain. What is the midbrain's function? Will says visual reflexes. Good. So it's that response to things that we see, a response to things that we hear. And it's a very quick reactive response. So it's more at a level of awareness. And remember, we talked about the reticular activating system. We usually, in neuroscience, we usually just refer to it as the RAS. The RAS partially resides in the midbrain. And the RAS is responsible for consciousness, being alert. But it's alert at just a very basic level. It's not like a thinking, perceiving type of alertness. It's just being aware, being awake. And we also talked about the fact that the RAS plays a part in the waking and the sleeping cycle. Kimberly had brought that up, and then I kind of elucidated on that a little bit more after I looked it up. Then we went a little bit higher to this part of the brain right here, known as the diencephalon. The diencephalon is higher than the brainstem. The brainstem literally is the stem of the brain. That's why we call it that. Now, the brainstem is usually thought of as controlling the functions of our body that keep us alive. The basic primal functions of all living things, like all animals. Kimberly, were you about to say something? Now, in the top of the diencephalon here, we have the thalamus. We have the hypothalamus, a little bit towards the front and below the thalamus. And then we have, right back here, the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland mainly is responsible for sensing light coming in through the eyes. The pineal gland is very close to the nerves that run into our eyes, which we call the optic nerves. The optic nerves take incoming light information from the eyes and they send it to the pineal gland. The pineal gland then determines whether it's daytime or nighttime and then sends signals down into the reticular activating system to start waking us up when needed. Or if there's no light, it sends messages to the reticular activating system to start helping us go to sleep. When there's damage to the reticular activating system in the midbrain, we have people that are comatose, in comas. So we're going to talk about the thalamus today and the hypothalamus. That is exactly where we left off. Let me go back to our notes. And we were continuing in the diencephalon. So please continue your notes right where you left off, right under epithalamus, pineal gland, day-night cycles. Please write the word thalamus. The thalamus, which happens to be towards the top of the diencephalon here, it's this structure, sorts out all the sensory impulses from the body and then sends that information to the cerebrum. The cerebrum is this highly folded structure, which most people think of as the brain when they think of the brain. But this is just one part, a major part of the brain. And it happens to cover the other inner parts of the brain, like the diencephalon and the brainstem. And so it creates almost like a covering around that brain. Now, the thalamus, because it sorts out sensory impulses from the body and sends them to the cerebrum, it's going to be intimately connected with the pons and the cerebellum. And it's going to be part of that coordination process that takes place processed in the cerebellum for movement, for dancing, for playing a sport, stuff like that. The thalamus also processes information about emotional awareness too, which we'll get to a little bit later. Now, the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. Hypo means literally in Latin under. So under thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. It is vitally important to homeostasis. That's not the only thing it does, but it is vitally important to our body's balancing system. The hypothalamus is another one of those brain structures that has involuntary control over body processes. Not so much like the brainstem to keep us alive, but involuntary processes that keep us healthy, that keep our body running. So in essence, not necessarily keeping us alive, but allowing us to stay alive and healthy. The hypothalamus has a lot of jobs. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. And we'll come back to the thalamus because the thalamus is a really important part of our emotional brain. So what the hypothalamus controls, please write that out and underline it. What is the functions of the hypothalamus and what does it control? Well, quite a bit, actually. First of which is blood pressure, heart rate, along with the medulla oblongata, our digestive tract. So as we eat, our digestive tract has to be stimulated to get the stomach muscles to start moving so that food can get broken up in the stomach and then squeezed out into the intestines. It also controls the intestines, so the intestines will start moving when food has been put into our body. It also starts happening when we get hungry. So the hypothalamus is intimately connected with hunger. It also controls the pupil of our eye. So if we have lots of light in front of us, our pupils get smaller to block that light from coming in so it doesn't hurt our eyes. We can see clearer. If there's not a lot of light, if it's very dark, our pupils open up so that we allow more light in so that we can see better in darker conditions. This is all part of what we call the autonomic control center. Heart rate is not just controlled by the medulla oblongata. There are other factors to heart rate. There's a lot that goes to controlling whether the heart speeds up or slows down. So the medulla oblongata is constantly interacting with the heart, telling it to speed up or slow down, and then the hypothalamus is controlling all of the fluids around the heart to enable it to speed up and slow down. So it's just two different ways of controlling the same thing. But there's lots of other things that also happen in the autonomic control system. These probably are the most important to mention. It also is responsible for our emotional response, which includes our perception of pain, pleasure, fear, and lots of other things that are part of our emotional response. The hypothalamus and the thalamus are part of a system known as the limbic system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We'll go in depth to that system when we get into more of how the different parts interact together. But it's important to note that the hypothalamus is part of this limbic system, a very important part of the limbic system. Some people have larger hypothalamuses, some people have smaller hypothalamuses. It's thought that a larger hypothalamus creates more emotional response to interactions. Somebody who is more driven by pain, pleasure, and fear. People with smaller hypothalamus tend to be less driven to this emotional response to reality. Now, these are all still very primitive brain functions. We haven't really talked about more complex things like problem solving, like my gosh, my brain is going blank. Speaking of brains, like long-term planning, short-term planning. This part of the brain that we're talking about, the diencephalon, specifically the hypothalamus, a little bit the thalamus, is responsible for our deep down feelings that we have towards things, people, events, things that we feel before we think about. That's happening in the hypothalamus and in the whole limbic system. There's a bunch of parts of the brain communicating with each other in those 6 major parts. The hypothalamus also controls our body temperature. So if your body is cold, your hypothalamus, which has lots of blood flowing near it, will sense that the body needs to warm up. Remember, when the body needs to warm up, we can cause muscles to tighten up in our integumentary system, which causes us to burn energy in those muscles. That's goosebumps. It can also cause us to shiver. involuntary muscle contractions. Remember, the hypothalamus controls involuntary things. If we are too hot, it can also stimulate those sweat pores, those glands in our sweat pores of our integumentary system to release liquids to try to cool us down by evaporation. It can change the amount of blood flow to different areas of our body by interacting with other brain structures. It's responsible for controlling our hunger response, our thirst response, and the feeling of needing to sleep. All of that is controlled in the hypothalamus. It's a very important brain structure. And it does all of this through chemical messengers known as hormones. So the hypothalamus, while it is a part of the nervous system, it also is an important part of the endocrine system, or our body's hormonal system. It can control other processes in the body, like feeling like you need to urinate, feeling like you need to drink more water. That feeling of thirst can be a result of your excretory system, your kidneys and bladder, sending signals to the hypothalamus through the blood with these chemical messengers, hormones, to start this process of feeling like you need to drink or feeling like you need to urinate. That's just a very simple explanation, but the hypothalamus also falls in the endocrine system too, because it is responsible for making these hormones and responding to other hormones. So the hypothalamus, being an important part of our emotional response, is part of this system of brain parts we call the limbic system. The limbic system includes the frontal lobes of the brain, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the thalamus, which we talked about a few moments ago, the hypothalamus, which we were just talking about, the amygdala. The amygdala is very important in our fight or flight response. People who have, it's believed people who have like post-traumatic stress disorder have an overactive amygdala. The amygdala responds to fear and it creates bodily reactions in order to deal with that fear. Hippocampus is another structure that's found in the cerebrum. And then the olfactory bulbs, which are what sense smell. Now, this is an important one to talk about. The olfactory bulbs. They are directly connected to these brain structures that are responsible for emotional response and perceiving emotions. That's okay, Amelia. Thanks for letting me know. I hope it improves. And if you think about it, smells are very intimately connected with our emotions, right? Our feelings of pleasure, anxiety, uncomfortableness, pain even. And when we smell things, we're getting signals that are stimulating this pocket of neurons that then sends messages directly into our emotional response centers, our limbic system. And so smells have a very powerful emotional response on us because of this connection. Smells have the ability to activate, deactivate, kind of coordinate our emotional response. This is why we have, products you can buy to smell that are supposed to calm you down, that are supposed to, energize you. This is why we have, this is why when you think of maybe celebrating a holiday, you may think of certain smells that you experienced during that pleasurable or not pleasurable experience. The limbic system is intimately connected to our sense of smell. It's not the case with any of the other senses. Okay, so you can see the limbic system kind of resides right here, and there's different brain structures that are part of that limbic system. We're going to now focus on this outer, very complex, larger portion of our brain, which we call the cerebrum. The cerebrum is this folded part of the brain. This is, remember, only half of a brain. So the other side would just be covered in this wrinkly cerebrum. So you can think of the cerebrum as pretty much covering all of the other brain structures that reside within. And it's highly folded so that we can get more cells in the nervous system, particularly in this part of the brain. This is where most of the processing that happens that creates you and the ideas of you happen. This is where we create most of our reality, is in the cerebrum, at least what we believe. When you slice the cerebrum and leave a bottom, slice the top off, you can see that there's two different types of nervous tissue. We have white matter, and then we have gray matter. Remember, gray matter is the cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. So we have lots and lots of neurons connecting to each other. Everywhere we have gray matter. The white matter, on the other hand, are just the myelinated axons. So white matter is basically like the wires to different parts of the brain or different parts of the body. And by folding the cerebrum, you can fit in a lot more gray matter than you would if it was just flat, if it was just one organ without any folds. And that's actually why we have all of these folds in our brain, so that we can pack more cerebrum inside of our skulls without making our heads so big that our moms would die giving birth to us. We've evolved a folded cerebrum so that as our brains got bigger and more complex, they just folded and folded and folded more on themselves to create a head that isn't too big to leave the birth canal from a woman's body. There's already a lot of stretching that happens during childbirth. If we didn't have a folded brain, we would either not be human in terms of the way we think and perceive and have the ability to critically think and use tools. We wouldn't be as intelligent as we are, or women's hips would have to be huge and have a huge birth canal to handle a big head. And of course, having a big head on a body like this would be dangerous. If you lean too much to one side, you could fall over. You could damage it. So evolution found the best solution to this problem was to fold the cortex. So let's watch a little video here. We're at 12:15. Okay, we're doing okay. And the video is going to talk a little bit about what the brain and particularly the cerebrum are responsible for doing and kind of how they do it. So please pay attention. It's about 4 minutes long, and then we'll take a few more notes before we move on.
Underneath the newfangled cortex, the brainstem, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia date back to the mastodons, the dinosaurs, and the first amphibians. In humans, the old parts of the brain oversee emotion and help build memories. They control heart rate and breathing. They also form intimate connections with the new brain, the cortex. Though less than a quarter-inch thick, the cortex is the brain's crowning glory. Among its roles, the cortex is our reality check. It filters and orders the outside world for us and allows us to see, touch, hear, and speak. The cortex is also the human thinking cap. All our plans, thoughts, and ideas originate in this layer. The cortex is packed with nerve cells. About 2/3 of all our neurons operate here. A piece of cortex tissue no larger than a pinhead can house 30,000 of these cells. Each neuron has a job to communicate with other neurons. The brain works by forming networks among these cells. The long spiny branches of the networks create a neural forest of astounding intricacy. Neurons use these communication lines to talk to each other with electric and chemical signals. Here under microscope are two neurons linking up. Though it may look like they fuse together, neurons don't actually touch each other. A closer look reveals that a tiny gap called the synapse separates their branches. This is where a message passes from one neuron to the next. The message comes from here, small sacs that store chemical molecules. When stimulated, these sacs release their molecules which cross the cell membrane into the synaptic gap. An electric zap allows this to happen. Meantime, the receiving neuron has special welcome sites for the incoming molecules. These receptor sites bind with the molecules. When they do, special gates open up. The gates let in a flood of charged particles, sodium and potassium ions, which start up a new electrical signal in the receiving neuron. This simple chain of events, an electrical zap, followed by chemical changes, followed by another electrical zap, is the basis of all brain activity. It's how neurons speak to each other. Here, then, is the key to the brain's complexity. There are 100 billion neurons in the brain. Each neuron, like a bit player in a grand production, processes its information, then hooks up with as many as 50,000 other neurons to send and receive messages. 100 billion neurons times 50,000 connections. It's this complexity that allows us to think imaginatively. On their own, neurons aren't very bright. But put 100 billion of them together in a small space and let them all start talking to each other, and you start to get brainstorms. The trillions of neural networks, like an improvisational orchestra, create new ideas and connect different thoughts in a whimsical and sometimes inspired fashion. It's this impromptu ability to produce new things in our brains that allows us to progress, that quite simply takes us from here to here.
Okay, so when we're talking about the brain and its processing power, he said that there's about 100 billion neurons with about 50,000 connections between those 100 billion neurons. So there's a lot of different ways that neurons can communicate with each other. The vast majority of this contact and connection is happening in the cerebrum. And so you can think of the cerebrum, like the person in the video called it, as our thinking cap. The organization of the world, which we call reality, the processing of our inputs and outputs and all of the interactions is what we think of as thinking and reality. And it's actually happening as a result of those 100 billion neurons communicating 50,000 different ways with other neurons. And depending on where that communication is happening at a moment determines what you're thinking about, what you're doing, what you're perceiving. And even more focused, most of that connection between neuron and neuron is happening here in the gray matter, which we call the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the gray matter on the surface of the cerebrum. And remember, the surface is highly folded, so we have a lot of surface area for the cerebral cortex. Your cerebral cortex is responsible for language, hearing, actually understanding what you're hearing, being able to talk, problem solving, and a whole host of other processes. Seeing. And so you could say that the cerebral cortex enables us to perceive, communicate, remember, understand, see, speak, and move. Now we're talking about move voluntarily. So, like, I want to move my arm up to my head. That was something I wanted to do. That was voluntary. That was controlled by my cerebral cortex, the gray matter of my cerebrum. And I'll show you exactly where that's taking place as we get through here. When I'm communicating, the muscles of my mouth have to be controlled. My tongue has to be controlled. My breathing has to be controlled through the diaphragm underneath my lungs. All of that is being controlled by the cerebral cortex. The vocal cords that are being tightened and loosened to make words have to be controlled by neurons in the cerebral cortex. Now, there's other areas that kind of communicate with other areas that control all of those processes, but they all happen in the cerebral cortex. So when you think of consciousness, think of it as our perception, communication, memory, understanding, ability to see, ability to speak, and move. I guess you could even add here too. I guess that kind of falls under perceive though, doesn't it? Now, scientists have spent many years mapping the cerebral cortex. And we can actually put people's heads into these big machines that are able to scan the brain as it's working without having to cut into it. And what we can do is we can have somebody try to speak something, and we can watch what part of the cerebral cortex becomes active in these machines. Or maybe we want to have somebody listen to something, and we see a different part of the cerebral cortex active at that time in these machines. Maybe we'll ask a person to move their fingers. Well, some aspect of this cerebral cortex will become active. If somebody's sensing something, like a sensation tapping their arm, they'll perceive it in this section of the cerebral cortex. We'll go through each one of these sections and talk about what they do, what's found in them. But these different areas of the brain are responsible for our consciousness as a human. The frontal lobe here is probably the most complex of the entire cerebral cortex. And it's because it's one of the newest additions to our cerebral cortex, evolutionarily speaking. And it's responsible for working memory with spatial tasks, determining where things are in 3D space, executive area for task management. So when you're trying to figure out how am I going to complete this task, that processing is happening in the frontal lobe. Knowing where something is in 3D space, like, oh, okay, I know this is right here. That processing is in my frontal lobe. And then really importantly, solving complex multitask problems happens in the frontal lobes. Lots of other things too. You can even look more closely at different parts of sections of the cerebral cortex, and you can map exactly what part of the body is controlled, what muscles are controlled by that section of the cerebral cortex. We'll talk about why this looks kind of weird. We'll probably talk about that next week. Also, If you look at the strip right behind the primary motor cortex, we have the somatosensory cortex, which you can map what area is responsible for perceiving different parts of the body. So, like your lips are perceived right here in your cerebral cortex, and it's the same for everybody. The tip of your thumb is perceived right here in the cerebral cortex. And so, if you had someone's brain open in front of you, let's say you're doing brain surgery on somebody, usually people stay awake for brain surgery because they have to stimulate certain parts of the brain to make sure that they don't cut out a really important part, like a part for controlling eye movements or controlling what you sense from your lips. And so we'll come back to this picture. It's kind of complicated. I'll come back to that in just a moment. A few more things to write for today. The 3 functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So we're going to break down the cerebral cortex into 3 primary areas, and then we'll jump down even smaller. There is the primary motor cortex. This controls movements of our muscles, our skeletal muscles, our facial muscles, and eye muscles. Damage to the primary motor cortex, which happens to be right here in the cerebral cortex, results in paralysis to the area that it controls. If you have damage to part of your primary motor cortex that's responsible for moving your lips, you won't be able to move your lips anymore. Or for controlling a certain part of your face, just like this guy, you won't be able to control those muscles anymore. And they tend to sag. They tend to atrophy when you can't move them. So this person had a stroke, and damage to part of his brain right here underneath his skull probably resulted. And we're going to stop right there. So once you get that last note in your composition book, you then are going to want to go to the Canvas module and look for that video I want you to watch and comment on. It's going to be a little bit of a review of what we've talked about. So strokes are usually caused by some issue in our blood, maybe our cardiovascular system, not just our blood, excuse me, where the blood can't get to a region of that brain. And so that results in a lack of oxygen. So when you can't get oxygen to a part of our brain, those cells die. And because for whatever reason blood can't take oxygen to that region of the brain, that part will be damaged. And it's usually, not usually, it's most likely permanent once that damage happens. What causes strokes? Cardiovascular disease can take different forms. Sometimes the blood vessels get clogged with cholesterol and plaque. Plaque is like a type of mixture between fat and cholesterol. So that literally blocks the blood from getting to that part of the brain because the blood vessels in the brain are really tiny. Blood vessels can get hard as we get older. It's called arteriosclerosis. It can also get hard due to medical conditions. And hardening of blood vessels can sometimes cause them to break, tear. Sometimes a blood vessel will actually inflate, and that inflation will cause it to pop. That can cause a stroke to the brain. Or some type of injury like blunt force trauma can literally just destroy the capillaries to that area of the brain. And blood then cannot get to those cells in order to get oxygen to them and keep them